Hello and welcome, this is Simracing Corner. I've had an RTX 3090 installed in my gaming PC for a few weeks now, and a major reason for this upgrade was for VR sim racing, so it's about time I showed you what this mammoth graphics card is really capable of in a number of racing titles in VR. I'll show you my in-game settings I've used and discuss my experiences in these games. The aim for the demonstrations is to maintain a totally stable 90 FPS throughout, without any reliance on SteamVR motion smoothing on my Valve Index VR headset. You should know, even with the RTX 3090, it's still impossible to push all the settings to Ultra along with the highest super sampling that your headset supports. So we are still looking at adjusting settings in each individual game for the best possible balance of performance to visual fidelity. And I've spent a lot of time doing this, so you may even learn a few things about optimizing your VR sim racing settings for the games coming up, as I will describe a lot of this in detail. Okay then, well that's the intro done, let's get into the action. This is Automobilista 2, first the graphic settings. From what I've tested, other than mirrors and raindrops, the other FX settings don't appear to work in VR or do so little I wasn't able to tell a difference. So you can leave these alone or turn them off, it doesn't seem to really matter. The real magic happens under the performance settings. I'll pause for a moment so you can take this in. You may be disappointed that no Ultra settings are used here. Ultra settings cost more as a performance hit to the GPU than you really get in return for any visual enhancement they offer in Automobilista 2 in VR. In fact, the difference between medium to Ultra settings in AMS2 is so close I found it next to impossible to tell them apart, and I spent a long time actually testing this, trying every single configuration. So I kind of know this by the amount of time I spent. So the game looks really great with medium settings on the Valve Index. Although I did test the Ultra settings on the RTX 3090, and to be fair, it mostly ran fine during a race, but there's always one or two spots on the track where there is a dip in frame rate, which you can tell there's a little bit of stutter on the headset. So everything I've done is to iron out those dips, so we have a great looking game and perfect performance from the start to the end of the race. And yeah, it looks really good. My combination of medium and high settings were perfect. Grass is set to low, as we don't really care about grass. One thing that can spoil the VR experience are jaggies, those stepped edges on 3D rendered objects, where in VR can give a distracting shimmering effect to the on-screen image as things move around. Because the picture is presented so close to the eyes, it is very pronounced in a VR headset, more so than say on a monitor. And of course, the solution is using super sampling, or another form of anti-aliasing which may be built into the game. And I found with the Index, combining traditional in-game MSAA, which is in Automobilista, along with some Steam VR super sampling worked the best for me. On the Valve Index, 120% Steam VR super sampling renders the picture at 2080 x 2452 pixels per eye. And there you have it, that's how I'm running this track in AMS2, along with 25 computer-controlled cars with the RTX 3090. It looks gorgeous and super smooth at a stable 90 frames per second. There are 2 or 3 minor frame dips into the high 80s in this run, but that's fine and quite normal. You may wonder, can we run these same settings at 120Hz? And I have some footage of that in action. Okay, we're unable to sustain a stable 120 FPS, it's quite erratic as you'll see here. as the race progresses and the cars spread out, things do settle. That's quite normal in VR driving games. At the start of the race, things are pretty cramped up, all the cars are together, and when cars spread out, when there's less basically effort for the GPU to render things, things do improve. However, we're only getting 120 for split seconds at a time here. What this footage doesn't capture is that unstable erratic frame rate, for me, is a quite stuttery moving picture from my point of view in VR. It's an absolute mess. Take note of the graph and the GPU utilization percentage. As the GPU utilization percentage hits the high 90s, look out for the orange lines, or in this case clusters of orange. These indicate warnings of high frame times, and during these situations is when there is observable stutter. High frame times means a longer than normal delay between the next frame being presented. So what we can learn from this is an erratic frame rate is bad news in VR. We can fix this situation by running fewer cars or having another crack at the graphics settings. So a stable 120 FPS is achievable on the RTX 3090, but frankly I'm happy with 90 FPS, and it does mean I can have a nice, smooth moving, stable and super crisp looking representation of the game. Before we move on to the next demonstration, back to the previous test run footage and take another look at the frame time data and GPU utilization usage. What I've discovered is 70 to 80% average GPU utilization is the sweet spot for a stable, consistent frame rate for my VR racing games, and that still leaves some breathing space for any peaks. Some people make the mistake of looking at the GPU utilization here and will think from a perspective of playing games on a flat screen. There are different considerations at play for maintaining smooth motion in VR, so I thought it was an important point to cover, and hopefully that should answer any comments regarding what's going on here. It's completely premeditated. As you will see all other tests coming up, I aim to maintain this comfortable zone of GPU utilization. We're not quite done with Automobilista 2, using the same graphics performance settings and the same track as before, but this time with some typical UK bank holiday Monday weather. Adding wet race conditions does run the RTX 3090 a little bit harder. We can see this with the GPU utilization being a bit higher, but still within safe margins, and the frame rate is sticking to 90 for the most part, and around 85-ish for split seconds now and then, and that still provides perfectly smooth, stutter-free motion. Finally, a nighttime race. So the same settings as before, and it's also the same track, and it's running perfectly. As with wet weather conditions, nighttime races are slightly more taxing for any graphics card, and our RTX 3090 is chewing through this very nicely. Automobilista 2 is powered by the same graphics engine as Project Cars 2, that's called the Madness engine, so the demonstrations and my settings used here would effectively carry over to Project Cars 2 very nicely. We're not looking at Project Cars 2 here today, as it seems pointless for this reason. This is Assetto Corsa Competizione. Before we look at the graphics settings, observe the struggling CPU frame time graph on the right and the surprisingly casual effort of GPU utilization on the left. The footage being shown is the best balance settings I was able to achieve, or at least settle with, I guess, to hit some sort of level expectation, which I was happy to run with. What I discovered through testing this game, from what seems like hours of adjusting settings and observing the results by lap after lap, is the graphics card doesn't struggle at all really, but the CPU side does. I was running some of the high graphics settings and the GPU wasn't displaying any excessive load. However, I did experience a lot of stutter, and it was all coming from the poor CPU frame times. So I don't profess to be an expert on this subject, but what it looks like to me is the CPU is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the graphics effects, and as I reduced the graphics settings it improved the CPU frame times, yet the GPU utilization didn't really change dramatically. So the RTX 3090 wasn't a sticking point for this game, and the processor, which is an i9 9900K, is a fantastic CPU for gaming. So I really think it's just poor optimization of the game code, holding things back when those terrible frame times are penalizing us with stuttering. Now let's take a peek at those graphics settings. During my many adjustments and trials, I discovered it was substantially more resource efficient to use Steam VR supersampling to improve the picture sharpness than it was to use the VR pixel density setting that's built into the game engine. So I made many concessions with the graphic settings to minimise the CPU frame timing issues, but the fact we're running ACC at 160% supersampling is quite amazing, yet the RTX 3090 is not even breaking a sweat. And just to make a point, because you may wonder this, I only increased the supersampling after discovering all the other graphics effects were creating this CPU issue for me. Yeah, so it's not related to the super sampling I've applied here. I only discovered I was able to ramp up the super sampling much later. It's an unexpected surprise considering all the other things I've had to do to get this game to run nicely for me. So although it looks a bit flat and bland because of the lower visual settings used, the picture sharpness is very good because of the high level of super sampling. And personally, I do prefer this balance given the option. A sharp picture in VR for me is much more important than fancy post-processing effects. So not a complete washout, and we learnt a few things along the way. One being that the RTX 3090 is not holding the highest graphic settings back in ACC. There are other factors at play. This is RaceRoom, released in 2013, but still getting updates and new paid content now and into the future. I enjoy this title despite its aging graphics engine. The visuals are not exactly current generation cutting edge, but I can look past that because it is a solid driving game. The RTX 3090 has no problem doing its part. However, during my testing, then some confusion, followed by quite a bit of research, I discovered RaceRoom's performance in VR is severely bottlenecked because of limitations of how the game is coded. RaceRoom uses DirectX 9, it's a very old API dating back nearly 20 years. I expect this is part of the reason, or the main reason. I've also read claiming RaceRoom only uses a single CPU core to run. In VR, everything is rendered twice, and this extra workload seems to be causing this overload. You can see the CPU frame times are a complete mess, and this creates a constant microstutter. The RTX 3090 is doing very little work here. You can look at that GPU utilization and the GPU temperature. It's very moderate. Poor CPU frame times are just as bad as poor GPU frame times. They both affect the frame rate and will create stutters if they get out of control. For smooth running motion in games, both the CPU and GPU should show balanced activity, and that's not what we're seeing here. I did eventually work out how to get this under control and identify the graphic settings that were putting the smackdown on the CPU. By reducing the settings, shown here, it subdued the problem. The other concession was dropping the maximum number of visible cars to 20. In-game anti-aliasing did not seem to be one of the problem settings attacking the CPU frame times, so I applied 4 times MSAA plus 150% Steam supersampling. The result is a really crisp, detailed image, so we do have that. And this is what RaceRoom looks like with those graphics settings applied. It still looks very decent, and performance wise, those CPU frame times are not completely in the green 100% of the time. I can see that, you can see that, but I'm only made aware of this fact by the data streamed in front of me. So we have a winner. The CPU frame times are no longer compromising the frame rate, and we're glued to 90 FPS. It's super smooth, and the game looks really sharp on the Valve Index. If you get the settings nailed in RaceRoom, it's actually a very good looking game in VR, and yeah, it's a fun title. I would recommend it, quite honestly. Yeah, it's a little bit of work to get the settings right, but I have to say, you know, it's worth it, and all you need to do is look at the settings I've applied and just use that as your baseline, and you should be good. Now we're on to Dirt Rally 2.0. For all the other racing titles featured in this presentation, I've used a separate PC to capture the game footage, to completely remove any overhead on the gaming PC to ensure authentic results. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible with this game. Long story short, when you launch Dirt Rally in VR, it changes the desktop resolution, and that messed up the way my capture setup works. So for Dirt Rally 2.0, I'm recording with OBS on the same PC that we're running the game on. Do understand that means we are using additional resources that will have a small impact on the gaming performance. With that said, Dirt Rally is running really well here regardless, at mostly high settings across the board, including a very nice 150% super sampling, which on the Valve Index is 2468 times 2740 pixels per eye, and the RTX 3090 is running absolutely great, and everything looks amazing with rich shadows and lighting effects, and just look at the reflections in those puddles. Yes, it's very, very pretty. This is a title I've always preferred in VR, partly because I find rally driving is much easier in VR. I make far fewer mistakes, having the ability to look around makes braking and power sliding around corners is much easier to judge and navigate. My old graphics card was a GTX 1080 Ti, and still a decent performer in the latest games. In Dirt Rally 2.0, however, the 1080 Ti did struggle at times, but particularly in Rallycross with the extra cars on screen, I never managed to get a solid frame rate even at very low settings. Rallycross in VR was barely playable on the GTX 1080 Ti for me. But no such problem with the RTX 3090 installed in my PC. However, I did need to tame some of the graphic settings as they impacted CPU performance, causing some erratic CPU frame times. This is something we've seen before, so yeah, interesting. So this resulted in some stutter when the opponent cars are buzzing around in view. We still managed to maintain the 150% super sampling and in-game anti-aliasing, the 2x MSAA, giving us sharp alias-free picture quality. As we've gone through these racing games, we're seeing the RTX 3090 is performing great, but we're finding that the CPU is the bottleneck, preventing us using higher visual settings. And yeah, my CPU is hardly a slouch. So we'll talk about this a bit more at the end of the video, but we're seeing a running theme here that the RTX 3090 is actually more capable than what my CPU is in some of these games. Assetto Corsa released back in 2014, still very popular to this day because of the huge resource of modded tracks and cars produced by the community. Just so you know off the bat, I am using the shader patch that you can install using Content Manager. Content Manager is a third-party mod manager and launcher for Assetto Corsa, and it is the best way to run this game. And wow, just wow, take a moment, look at those amazing graphics. This driving game looks spectacular. Jaw-dropping is an understatement. Out of all the racing games in this video, Assetto Corsa is by far the most realistic and stunning in VR, and it's easily running that target 90 FPS like it's casually chewing gum, no problems at all. Where Assetto Corsa beats all the others is those incredible lighting effects, which makes everything pop. My graphic settings are shown here in this screenshot taken from Content Manager. As a piece of trivia, amazingly, during my time with Assetto Corsa Competizione, a game we tested earlier in the video, I spent 2 to 3 hours trying to dial in the settings, and it really wasn't a great success. But in Assetto Corsa, I spent virtually no time at all nailing it. 5 minutes to get this game looking awesome. I could possibly stretch the graphic settings a little bit more, as there certainly seems to be some breathing space. But I don't think it's necessary. It just runs great and looks awesome. And also with that 150% super sampling and 4 times MSAA, it's just spot on. It's super crispy. Normally, God rays are an unwelcome light reflection on VR lenses, but not this warming sunlight effect that's streaming through the windscreen. It's beautiful. The RTX 3090 is loving it, and so am I. Yeah, I really do need to add Assetto Corsa more regularly to my sessions and roster of video content output, as it really does deserve it. Most definitely give Assetto Corsa a bash in VR. It's an older title, you can pick it up from online key sellers for around £5. Yeah, with all the DLC included, yeah, it's that cheap. And yeah, that almost unlimited pool of free mods out there makes this an essential one to have in your library. So if you have an RTX 3090 and you do not have Assetto Corsa, get it right now. rFactor 2 and the final game I'll be testing today, a title I only briefly tried out on my old GTX 1080 Ti quite a long time ago in VR, and I found the performance in VR was really subpar. And yeah, so since that time I've just enjoyed playing rFactor 2 on my monitor. So I am very interested to find out if the RTX 3090 was finally going to give me a sufficient boost in VR performance that would make me come back for more. As it happens, the answer is yes, a big fat yes in fact. I'm super impressed how well it's running and how amazing rFactor 2 looks through the Valve Index. Much better than I expected. And check out that 195% ridiculous super sampling. The curious thing here is I only set 150% super sampling in Steam VR. So for some reason, rFactor 2 is upsampling the image further. Well, technically that is possible. Many VR games do have on-the-fly super sampling settings built into the game, though I wasn't able to find anything in rFactor 2, so yeah, quite strange. Maybe FPS VR is reading this incorrectly. It is quite hard to tell beyond 150% super sampling, as there is very little benefit beyond that level, but I do think it is an accurate read. You'll see a little later in the wet and nighttime race demonstrations where I've reduced the Steam VR super sampling in rFactor 2, and the image clarity is what I would expect at those settings. Before that, here's a quick peek at my rFactor 2 visual settings in these race conditions. As we've seen before, I found higher graphic settings hit the CPU frame times, but the RTX 3090 wasn't feeling the same impact. So again, we're forced to tune some graphic settings to keep everything in the green zone and prevent the CPU from being the cause for any dropped frame stutter. Super sampling is now at 130%, and some of the previous medium settings I had before have been dropped to low. Since the outside environment is overcast and drab, the lower settings don't make the game look any worse. And do check out that GPU utilization. It's working much harder with these rain effects running. Although there's a lot of orange showing in the frame time graphs, the actual frame rate is holding up well enough that I'm not experiencing any distracting stutter. Everything remains above 80 FPS, sort of 85, 90, you know, jumps around a little bit. But as the race opens up, the frame rate holds to 90 FPS most of the time. So everything I've set here is just about finely balanced. It's at that tipping point when it's just about, you know, good enough where you can't tell there's any kind of problems here. But yeah, I could probably tune it out if I really wanted to, but I was happy to run the game like this. It felt very smooth to me. So yeah, let's move on. Finally, rFactor 2 in a night race, road and environmental reflections. Those visual settings hit the CPU really hard once the skylights have been turned off. So I turned those effects off and everything ran fine, as you can see here. I could run higher super sampling, I don't think that's a problem, and I could have another crack at pushing up some of the other visual settings. But quite honestly, in a night race, you're not really seeing much out there, so I didn't think it really mattered. What really matters is smooth motion and a sharp looking picture, and that is exactly what we have here. rFactor 2 is excellent in VR, powered by the mighty RTX 3090, and I'll definitely be visiting this again in VR often from now on. I said at the beginning of this segment, this is a racing title I only briefly tested on my old 1080 Ti graphics card in VR, and I recall now that was for my Valve Index review for Simracing video. That was over a year ago, and yeah, it wasn't good on that graphics card back then, but with the RTX 3090, that's changed things up completely. It's very much an awesome title in VR. So yeah, loving it, and yeah, I certainly recommend it as a good VR title if your PC is up to the task. And we've come to the final part of this video. Lots of information to absorb from all these tests. If you watched all the way through, then you know that these racing games that we tested here were surprisingly CPU dependent on certain graphics setting effects, and I suspect the demands in VR, where the scene is rendered twice in real time, only magnifies that CPU workload, and that left the RTX 3090 sometimes not fully utilised. So the RTX 3090 still does have a bit more left in the tank, future-proofing it for when it comes time to upgrade to a faster CPU, and then I'll be able to leverage more from this graphics card. My i9-9900K is not a slow CPU. Specific VR optimization of the games themselves is a factor, and also not making full use of modern multi-core processors. The RTX 3090 for its part did a great job. In all the games we were able to substantially crank up the super sampling, giving me pin sharp image clarity through my Valve Index headset. Besides Assetto Corsa Competizione, which still remains largely a disappointment in VR, it's something that stretches beyond hardware limitations, frankly. We have to accept that. There's a whole video right there. I don't dislike this title, I actually enjoy this title immensely, but that one is strictly going to remain pancake for me. Elsewhere, we were able to get desirable results in both frame rate performance and visual quality. I enjoy all types of VR gaming genres. My old video card, the GTX 1080 Ti, which I've already mentioned, was generally great in almost all my VR games, but not sim racing games. It didn't quite have the chops. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't quite powerful enough. Lots of settings have to be lowered, and some noticeable frame rate stutter remained impossible to avoid. Upgrading to the RTX 3090, I finally have the VR sim racing experience I've always wanted. Ultimately, that is subjective. You don't need the latest and greatest hardware to operate VR, but more powerful hardware does enable you to run these games at settings that show them at their best in picture clarity and at solid frame rates. I'm now able to get the most out of my Valve Index, and that's down to the RTX 3090. It's a monster graphics card in power, size and cost. I'm sure there are plenty of dedicated VR sim racers out there that are interested to know how capable the RTX 3090 is in their favourite racing game. Hopefully this video has helped in that regard. Sorry, I don't subscribe to iRacing, so that wasn't included in my tests. Maybe something for the future, we'll just have to wait and see. I'm not here to tell you you must buy an RTX 3090. This is an informational video testing this very powerful graphics card. Frankly, an RTX 3080 would provide virtually identical performance in all the games I've shown you at less than half the price, and I would recommend that card if you are a VR sim racing enthusiast. My situation is mirrored by thousands of other gamers out there, finding it impossible to buy an RTX 3080 since it launched in 2020. The huge demand, compounded by the pandemic, resulting in short supplies around the world. The RTX 3090 isn't exactly commonplace either, but that higher price does make it easier to find stock. But even these get snapped up quickly by gamers who don't want to wait any longer. Yeah, this would have been a review for the RTX 3080 for Simracing if I was able to find one from an online retailer. I found my GTX 3090 on a retailer website. I didn't have to hawk around eBay and pay higher prices. It's just a retail price I paid. And if I skipped this opportunity when I saw it, I had no idea when the next time I would have been able to secure an upgrade for my GTX 1080 Ti. So yeah, it wasn't my first choice, but that's how things unfolded for me. I think we can end things here. I hope you enjoyed my content and found it useful. If you want to support my channel, there are various affiliate links in the video description. I post a new video every couple of days, so do check back soon. Until then, happy simming and bye bye.